When one thinks of the Eastern Front in World War II, you would most likely have an image in your mind of just purely ethnic Germans and mostly ethnic Russians going at it in Stalingrad, but this isn't actually that accurate of a picture. The Western Front was fairly straightforward and resembled a pretty conventional war, nation against nation, army against army. The Eastern Front, however, was an entirely different animal. Many don't know that in the final battle of the war in Europe, the Battle of Berlin, the last offenders were not mostly German, but in fact Frenchmen, Latvians and Scandinavians. These men had nothing to lose and fought fanatically to the end, fulfilling their oath to Adolf Hitler. But why was this the case? Why did Frenchmen, a nation conquered by Germany, fight to the death for Adolf Hitler? Why did Swedes, a people not even involved directly in the war, voluntarily decide to join up and risk or lose their lives fighting for Hitler's cause? Let's find out. The French, Latvians, Ukrainians, and all the others is another story, but today we shall talk about the Scandinavians, the SS Nordland and the SS-Wiking. As with all things Scandinavian, I apologise for any mispronunciations. Before the war, extremism was on the rise in Europe. Mussolini had marched on Rome and seized power, and many all over Europe tried to replicate him with fascist movements. Then, Adolf Hitler turned up with his National Socialism and became by far Europe's most predominant politician. All over Europe, the parties of the far right found a new inspiration. Whilst National Socialism is technically neither left nor right and is in a kind of category of its own, we'll call it the far right for simplicity's sake in this video. Whilst most of Europe was swept up in this new wave of extremism, the Scandinavians remained relatively untouched. In Denmark, you had the DNSAP, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Denmark, which was by far the most successful amongst a whole variety of smaller groups. In 1932, they won just 757 votes, mostly in Schleswig-Holstein, a land with heavy ties to Germany, but by 1939 they had won a rather respectable 31,000 votes and had won 3 seats in the Danish parliament. They never became a major force, however, as its leader, Christian Frederick von Schlalberg, a man who was actually born a German citizen himself, failed to unite all of Denmark's parties with his own. 1 year later, they would be occupied by the Germans, and to his annoyance, Hitler allowed the current Danish government to remain in power as the nation was left to function as it did before. Sweden had a similar issue, with tons of tiny little parties but no unity between them to form an actual political force. The most influential by far, however, was the tall, blonde, ex-Swedish army sergeant Sven-Olof Lindholm, who established the Swedish Fascist People's Party, and then, in 1939, the Swedish Socialist Union, or SSS. The membership only ever peaked at 5,000, however, and after this, the party only ever hit around 2%. The SSS party faithful would prove to be the best source of men later in Sweden for Himmler. Finland is rather distinct from its Nordic brothers, both historically and politically. It had been a part of the Russian Empire until very recently, and before that, part of the Swedish Empire. Independence had only come in 1917, and even then, a bloody civil war followed a month later. To Finns from then on, the importance of petty party politics paled in comparison next to the need to hold on to their precious independence. For example, upon the beginning of the Winter War against the Soviet Union, communists went straight to the front to fight alongside their brothers. To the Finns, it was people over politics. Regardless, political extremes did exist. The Communist Party, which was being supported by Moscow, was banned by the state, but the Patriotic People's Party, the IKL, was allowed to operate as normal. The IKL wasn't anywhere near as extreme as the NSDAP in Germany, for example, but it was still relatively fascist. They held 14 of the 200 seats in the national parliament, which was at least something, but it never truly challenged for true power in the nation. Unlike the SSS in Sweden, however, the IKL was not much of a recruiting force for Himmler. The nation with the most effective far-right movement by far, however, was Vidkun Quisling's National Unity Party, or NS for short. The party was founded in 1933 and heavily influenced by Adolf Hitler's NSDAP. The party even had its own SA-type paramilitary group known as the Herd, named after the Viking king's most loyal troops, and Quisling was called the Norwegian equivalent of Führer, Führer. There was also a youth wing called the NS Youth Front, led by the young Bjorn Ostring. Bjorn was a fierce nationalist and a die-hard anti-communist, and naturally, his group lined up perfectly with the German motives on the Eastern Front. The Youth Front would go on to be perhaps the most successful recruiting ground for the SS in Scandinavia. In 1933, however, the support for Quisling's NS was small. and although not striking a chord just yet with society on a whole, the 15,000 or so party members who did sign up were completely devoted to Quisling. As the years carried on towards the beginning of the war, the party didn't really grow as much as perhaps he had hoped, and usually only got around 2% of the vote. However, Quisling did make important contacts amongst fellow far-right leaders in a similar position to him abroad. So overall, extremist politics weren't that common in Scandinavia at the time, and in general, people were just happy to get along in their isolated liberal democracies up north, much like the Scandinavians of our day. For many people, this changed, however, with one major event. On the 30th of November, 1939, Red Army tanks rolled across the Finnish border into the snowy abyss, looking to supposedly secure their northwestern flank. How exactly the Finns were a threat to Stalin's empire is a mystery, but regardless, invade they did. The poorly equipped and massively outnumbered Finns fought bravely and held on for dear life against some of the most unfair odds in history. All over the world, people were inspired by tiny Finland and their population of 3.7 million against the Soviet Union, the biggest country on the planet, with a population of 170 million. The British and French offered support, but it never came properly, and it seemed to be all talk. Their neighbour, Sweden, also declined to join, despite many in the government wishing to do so. Whilst Finland's neighbours' governments chose not to intervene, this did not mean that their fellow Nordics themselves as a people did not care. The rallying cry went up and volunteers poured into Finland to join the struggle against naked communist aggression. 1,200 Danes made their way and served as a complete battalion. From Norway came 727. The biggest contribution of all, however, was the 8,260 Swedes who poured over the nation's border to help their former subjects. Another 500 Swedes also signed up directly to the Finnish army. Obviously, even with all this help, and no matter how many casualties they inflicted on the Red Army, they were never going to stop the endless waves of men being thrown at them, and in March 1940, the Finns sued for peace, getting slightly harsher terms than they would have gotten if they just handed over the land in the first place when requested. Regardless, the Finns had left around 200,000 Red Army soldiers dead in the snowy wastes of Finland, and they were seen as heroes on the world stage. Most of all, and most relevant to this video however, a new generation of Nordic men had now suddenly become die-hard anti-communists in a matter of months, and they were itching to get back out there and enact revenge, somewhere or somehow. They didn't have to wait long. In Germany, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, had a vision that would bring these men together into a struggle that would leave most of them dead or their lives changed forever. In 1939, the SS had around 25,000 men who were almost entirely German citizens or ethnic Germans from outside the Reich's borders, and due to the way manpower was distributed in the German draft, Himmler and his SS were only left with at best 2% of the available men. In order to solve this problem and realise his dream for an ideological army loyal to Adolf Hitler, he took the advice of his colleague, Gottlob Berger. Berger had been looking into the possibility of recruiting from what the SS called, quote, similarly related lands, such as Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Holland, and Flanders in Belgium. The British and even Americans of Anglo-Saxon stock were viewed as part of this group too, but obviously the logistics of recruiting these men were beyond their capabilities at the time. The plan turned to reality just 11 days after German paratroopers began landing all over Denmark, and the order went out to establish a new Scandinavian SS regiment, the SS Nordland. The regiment was supposed to be composed of 2,000 men, but recruitment at first was slow, which is unsurprising given that the Germans had quite literally just invaded these people's countries, and many feelings of anger or confusion at the situation were still fresh. Also, the Germans were not yet at war with the Soviet Union, so anti-communism was not an effective recruitment tool just yet. By the end of June 1940, only 200 Norwegians, 112 Danes, and a handful of Swedes came forward. Many cited that they felt the Nordland was, quote, too German at the time. On June the 15th, the Low Countries equivalent, the SS Westland Regiment, was established with far better success, and more than 1,000 Flemish and Dutchmen signed up. Berger and Himmler were not put off by the disappointing numbers in Scandinavia, however, and they opened recruitment offices in Oslo and Copenhagen, and later in the year, Himmler persuaded Hitler to allow him to create the 5th Waffen-SS Division. The new formation was initially named the SS Germania, and the order to establish it read, "The Führer and the Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht has ordered the establishment, within the framework of the army, of a new SS division, which shall utilize the manpower becoming available from those countries inhabited by people of related stock." The name was quickly changed to the SS-Wiking Division in January 1941, due to some confusion with names, as the 4 regiments making up the division were the Germania, the Westland, and the Nordland, and a German manned artillery regiment. Now, as the division took on a more Nordic character and tensions between the Soviet Union and Germany began to rise on the Reich's eastern border, recruitment became easier, and over time, the Viking would become perhaps the most famous division of the war, and thousands would end up serving in Himmler's SS. But why did these thousands decide to join Adolf Hitler on his crusade, even though it almost certainly meant death or serious injury? Whilst the anti-communism aspect was a large one, it wasn't the only one. Firstly, a profile. After the war, a Danish sociologist carried out a large study on 3,718 men who served in the Waffen-SS, or as Luftwaffe anti-aircraft troops. The study indicated that the vast majority were from cities and larger towns, and many were very highly educated and from the middle class. And of course, naturally, a large amount of them were members of far-right parties and were staunchly anti-communist. One thing that was abundantly clear from this investigation and various others was that pay and reward were not a major factor in the slightest. One of the first Danish recruits was a serving army officer named Erik Brorop. Born in 1917, he grew up as middle class and was well educated. He complained bitterly of his time in the Danish military and said snobbery was rife, which prevented him from being promoted when he clearly deserved it. His service was cut short in 1940 when the Germans occupied Denmark. A little later, he heard stories from his colleagues of the Waffen-SS and their exploits in France and the Low Countries, and that they had a recruiting office in Copenhagen for the Nordland. He said it wouldn't hurt to check it out, and he was immediately impressed with their professionalism and how they immediately offered him his equivalent rank, treating him with the respect he felt he deserved. After the war, he said, quote, "So much for motivation. Basically, I went to Germany because they treated soldiers right. I was a professional soldier, and I am damn proud of the fact that as a foreigner, I became an officer in one of the best divisions ever, and I have never rued or regretted what I did." Another Danish volunteer named Emil Stahl, who joined the Nordland at the age of 19, stated that he had huge support from family and friends in volunteering, and that a big factor in him joining was that he, like many others at the time, felt a war between Germany and the Soviet Union was inevitable. 2 Norwegians spoke in a similar vein. Leif Christiansen said, quote, "I didn't know what Quisling stood for and what he thought, but I could see the British plot developing, provoke German occupation of Scandinavia in order to produce a German-Russian war." The other, Ollie Brunes, said, "Though I doubted we would come into action in time, England, Germany's only opponent left, was nearly beaten. We accepted the aim of Norwegian independence. Later on, from the 22nd of June 1941, the motivation of volunteers was plain enough, to fight the Soviet communism threatening Europe, and thereby Norway." Many others had only one thing on their minds though: revenge for Finland. Given that the Soviets had attacked the Finns completely unprovoked, it didn't seem much of a stretch to imagine that the same thing would happen again later, but this time, Finland would most likely be wiped from the map. Then, Sweden would be sharing a border with the Soviets, and Stalin, if he so wished, could march all the way to the west coast of Norway to secure those ever so valuable ports. A very common quote, or some variation of it from recruits, was, "I fought for Finland, not for Germany," or "I fought for Sweden, not for Germany." The fear of communism for many in Western Europe was perhaps hard to understand, as it wasn't on their doorstep, but this story was all too familiar to the Eastern Europeans who had been through hell under this brutal regime. Stalin's own brutality was the best recruitment tool Himmler could hope for. Latvia, a nation where hundreds of thousands of its tiny population of 1.7 million were shipped off to Siberia, never to be returned, or simply shot, was to become the nation with the most SS recruits of all. Not all of the Scandinavians fought for such aims, however. Many, like millions of others in Germany and across Europe, were completely captured by Adolf Hitler and his vision for the future. They saw before them Hitler's vision of a new Europe of Germania-esque cities and a focus on national unity. They hated the foreign influence in their nations, as well as the individualism that came with capitalism, and as a result they were more than willing to perhaps set aside their own lives so that their people could live in Hitler's National Socialist vision of the future, or their own nation's variation of it, like Quisling's in Norway. Even the future first Icelandic president's son, Bjorn Sveinsson Bjornsson, was completely captured by Hitler's mission. As soon as news reached him of Operation Barbarossa, he decided to join the Viking, writing on his application, "I certify that I am of pure Aryan stock. Heil Hitler." He, and around 20 others, ended up fighting for the SS, and Bjorn managed to live to tell the tale. Another important aspect as to why so many men joined the SS, even those who had fought against the Germans when they were invading Norway, was the Germans' behaviour during and after victory. From the beginning, Hitler made sure that his men maintained good relations with the locals and the local governments, if possible. In Denmark, it was often called the model occupation, and the government was allowed to carry on as normal, and the police were given their weapons back so that life could continue, just with the Germans using some of the nation's military installations. In Norway, the story was pretty much the same. A Norwegian who signed up, named Bjorn Dramstad, recalls, "The Germans were very correct in their behaviour. They treated the Norwegian POWs well, and were friendly towards us civilians. If they had behaved worse, then maybe I wouldn't have joined, but my war and motivation were for Finland in any case, and not Germany." Another Norwegian, named Bjorn Ostring, served in the Norwegian army during the invasion, but was quickly released, as were all the other Norwegian POWs, and he said, quote, "My hometown had about 5,000 inhabitants, and the German general Engelbrecht quartered as many soldiers there. Relations between them and the population were correct and friendly. Most of my friends held the same views as I did." He claims that this is one of the deciding factors in why he signed up for the SS. So ultimately, World War II wasn't as simple as different armies fighting on a map. Other countries were dragged in, and as a result, many chose to pick a side and fight during this 6 years of chaos to decide the future of Europe. In the end, over 15,000 Scandinavians who answered the call were accepted, and they pledged their undying loyalty to Adolf Hitler. In general, only around 1/3 of those who tried to volunteer made it in. Many condemn these men regardless, and many see them as heroes fighting against communism, but regardless of your views on them, they all certainly had their own logical reasons for signing up. Whether you choose to condemn them for this is up to you. Thank you very much for watching. If this video is well received, then I will turn this video into a kind of mini-series on the Viking. So if you do want to see that, then please let me know in the comment section below, and be sure to leave a like. As always though, a very special thank you to not only my patrons this time, but also to my first subscriber on Subscribestar. Without them, this mission to take this channel full time would be far, far harder than it is, and I cannot thank them enough from the bottom of my heart. So if you want to join our Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or if you just want to support my channel, then please consider signing up using the Patreon or Subscribestar link in the description. Thank you very much. Thank you to my patrons, Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Bergland, Levi E, Lanza, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wonderwaffer, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, and Inflection Point from Subscribestar.